John, what are the states where we should be focusing our attention when where Americans, frankly, should be engaging with their state legislatures to help drive some change here?
Every state legislature should be taking a top to bottom look at their election laws. I'm not claiming that this is a stolen election, far from it. But it is a fact that a very large number of people in this country now do not have faith in the integrity of our elections. And I think that is a real problem. I'd like to comment briefly on what Steve just said. I agree with him about machines and the capability of their being manipulated. I'm not saying that happened in this election, but it certainly could happen. I disagree with him completely about voter ID laws. It should be very easy to obtain a voter ID. There are all sorts of mechanisms that can be put in place to make sure that very small percentage of the population, I don't think it's anywhere near 5 to 10%, get an ID. And I don't know whether in-person voter fraud is vanishingly small or just people don't really look for it. But I agree with him that is not really where the problem lies. The real problem lies with mail-in ballots and absentee ballots, and there should be a voter ID requirement for those, too.
Mm-hmm. Stephen, this debate is happening now in these legislatures across the country. But do you suspect that this is primarily going to be a push among Republican legislatures, or do you think that we actually could see movement in places like Nevada, where there's a Democrat majority, and they had real significant problems last year with dead voters on the voter rolls that hadn't been purged, with folks that were voting that were no longer living in Nevada, and other ineligible voters. What are your thoughts on what you expect to see as this debate plays out?
Well, there's this idea of what's called list maintenance, in which you purge the voter rolls of people that have moved out of the jurisdiction or have died off. And that is certainly something that should be done. It should be done regularly, and there's room for improvement in that. However, I want to push back a little bit. There's very little evidence that significant numbers of people that were on those rolls that shouldn't have been actually voted, especially in numbers large enough to actually change the outcome of any of these elections. So while I think improvements in list maintenance and voter purges can be done, and I think that could be something that you could make a decent case to even in a Democratic-controlled legislature. I don't know whether it's the kind of thing that we need to say, oh, because of that, we can't be confident in the results of our elections.
Well, look, it's not a matter of one thing or another, but we have an election in upstate New York that still hasn't been decided yet. There were ineligible voters. It's down to now a few dozen votes. There were dead voters. These have been found. You had people who were non-citizens who were voting. You had people that had moved out of the jurisdiction, and actually, those objections to those ballots were in the hundreds. So it can make a difference when we have an electorate that is that evenly split in many cases. John, what role, if any, can the federal government play here? We always look to Washington, right? One of the things that we're doing with this segment is trying to take the focus away from Washington and look at these state legislatures. But putting aside the political reality that Democrats may not necessarily want to have this conversation, should the GOP take back the House or the Senate? Is there a way that federal funding can be tied to certain reforms, or would that be unconstitutional? It's like, what role can Washington play here?
Well, the Democrats are trying, in fact, through H.R. 1 and S1, the so-called For the People's Act, to basically federalize our elections. I think that is a dreadful mistake. We leave states with the ability to determine how to conduct elections and how to appoint electors, and that's where it belongs. I mean, Congress can and often does tie federal funding to certain federal mandates. If they want to provide some funding to help states do things like, for instance, clean up their voter rolls, I suppose that's fine. But trying to tie it to federal mandates, such as eliminating voter ID laws or requiring same-day registration, I think would be a disaster.
Stephen, your thoughts on the federal government getting involved in this reform process?
Article 1 of the Constitution clearly says that Congress has the right to regulate the manner in which elections take place for federal offices. Mm-hmm. It has done it many times with the Help America Vote Act, with the motor voter law.
But that's for federal offices,
the Voting
right,
Rights
Steve?
Act. And I don't think this is any exception. I think that H.R. 1 is a perfectly good idea. I don't see any reason why we couldn't have same-day registration. We should try to make it easier for people to vote, not harder. The 20 states that have had same-day registration have shown no reported increase in in-person voter impersonation fraud. I myself did a study using the Heritage Foundation, a conservative foundation's own database of supposed voter fraud instances, and there was no correlation between how strict or lenient the state's laws were regarding mail voting and the per-person rate of voter fraud. So again, I think the federal government is certainly an appropriate way for election reform. They ought to require that we use hand-marked paper ballots. And I don't really think that things like same-day registration are going to lead to an explosion of fraud in this country.
John, you're at the Heritage Foundation, so I'm going to give you the last word and give you an opportunity to respond.
Yeah, as the person who created that database and make sure of the accuracy of all of the entries, that database, our election fraud database, which I encourage your listeners to go to, is just a list of convictions in different states or judicial orders overturning elections because of fraud. It is not comprehensive. It doesn't cover allegations of voter fraud. And in those states that have very, very lax systems or choose not to investigate credible claims of voter fraud after elections, you're not going to end up with a conviction. And if you don't end up with a conviction, it's not going to be in the election fraud database.
Thanks for watching the Heritage Foundation's YouTube channel. With more than 500,000 members, we are the nation's largest conservative research and education institution. We believe the principles and ideas of the American founding are worth conserving and renewing. Please help us further our mission by subscribing to this channel and sharing our videos with your family and friends.